Hey everybody, I'm Robin Knatzer and I'm here today with JJ and Tanya, two members of the Mobile Accessibility Task Force. Now, if you haven't heard of the Mobile Accessibility Task Force, there's no worries at all. That is exactly why we're here today to talk about what is this, why it's important to you as a developer, how to stay in the loop with this task force and what it's producing right now. And even we're going to talk about how you can contribute yourself or how your company can contribute to this task force and its missions. But before we get into all of that, let's take a step back and let JJ and Tanya introduce themselves really quick.
Yeah, I guess you called my name first, so I will start. Yes, I'm Jan Jaap or JJ. I work at Abra, and Abra is one of the contributors also to the App Foundation. And Abra is also then a member of the W3C. So in that regard, we are here as a W3C member, but not representing W3C, just representing our own opinion. And so my background is in computer science, so I studied computer science and wanted to focus more on accessibility. So now I'm really focused on building apps and helping others build accessible apps and doing consultancy, as well as building software to automatically check the accessibility of apps. And that's where it's really useful to have to know how do you actually test, because there's a lot of interpretation in the WCAG guidelines, and that's what the Mobile Accessibility Task Force is working on. And I'm glad my colleague Tanya is also contributing there.
Yes, thank you, Jan Jaap, for short introduction. My name is Tanya, and I'm working with Jan Jaap and with Abra already for a couple of years. My background in mobile app development started over 10 years ago as an entrepreneur, developing custom mobile apps. So I gained through the years experience not only about the mobile development, but also how different stakeholders work, think, and also development teams. And for me, moving into accessibility felt like a natural step. So I started with learning about WCAG guideline and diving into the audits of the mobile apps. And afterwards also consulting companies and helping them to improve the accessibility of the mobile apps. And in the past year, we worked on creating our own ABRA rules based on our practice, so on all audits that we made, and I was mapping it to the WCAG guideline. And that's where the most questions came: how to interpret things, how do we test things, whether there is one approach and one interpretation of the guidelines. So that's for me was the moment that I said, I would like to join the Mobile Task Force as well. And that's what happened earlier this year.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Got some very easy questions to get started. So, for the people who are listening who have never heard of the task force, let's see, JJ, can you give an overview? What exactly is the Mobile Accessibility Task Force and why this is an important thing to talk about?
Yes, I think it helps to tell a little bit more about the structure of the W3C. So W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium. So we already have web and not app, but of course apps are sort of part of the web, just not a website, I guess. And then the W3C has a lot of working groups. So one of the working groups is the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, so AGWG. So they have a lot of abbreviations, just like WCAG itself. So they are building web content accessibility guidelines, abbreviation WCAG, and then they have a lot of task forces that are building certain parts of the guidance. So the Mobile Accessibility Task Force is a task force of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, so really assisting the larger group with their guidance. But it's also possible that the task force itself is also publishing guidance. So we are publishing our document, which will be called WCAG to Mobile, which is then an informative guidance. So it doesn't set any requirements. It's just informative document telling you how you could interpret it, at least how our members of the task force are interpreting it. And something similar that people might be familiar with is WCAG to ICT. This is also part of certain legislation in the world. Yeah, and I guess the main difference between us and WCAG to ICT is that we are explicitly focusing on mobile applications, be it Android, iOS, but also mobile web, plus hybrid apps that sort of have mobile app with sort of web content. And WCAG to ICT is broader because they focus on anything that's non-web. So that would be like a kiosk or e-reader or just anything that's not the web but still needs to be accessible. And we are just scoping a little bit smaller so we can be a little bit more specific in our guidance because we can really just target mobile apps and not all other kinds of ICT.
That's super cool. So, out of all of these work groups, you guys are specifically working on mobile. So, we're thinking Android and iOS applications here. And it sounds like your main output that you're making as a task force is this guidance document that's going to help us as developers understand how we should be interpreting WCAG because it was made for web, how we should be changing our applications that are sometimes not always the same as websites. Is that it? Like this document is going to be that kind of guidance for us?
Yes, but still, it's a first step. Like I think one thing that's very missing and that we're not focusing on right now is sort of techniques. So we are telling you how to interpret the guidelines so you can sort of help you finding out if your app passes or fails a certain success criterion. But if you fail it, we are not providing solutions. So that are sort of called the techniques. So we are not at this stage adding techniques like, okay, you're missing alt text. How do we actually fix this in an Android app, an iOS app, or in sort of a hybrid app, or in any kind of framework? We're not having that guidance, but at
Is
least,
that something that you guys are planning for the future after this
yeah,
guidance?
yeah, that's a further stage. But it takes a long time to make just the guidance, and once that's finalized, we will start looking into expanding sort of the techniques. In addition to what we're also missing is understanding. So we have the success criterion that are relatively short, and then WCAG also has these understanding documents, and those have a lot more detail, a lot more nuances, and a lot more sort of details and examples. And that's also something we're not focusing on yet. But once we have the first document ready, we will look into expanding to sort of understanding and techniques.
Okay, so that's really good to hear that at a later date, the idea is to have something as rich as WCAG for mobile specifically with the understanding document, with the techniques and the criterion all together.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. That's definitely missing right now when we're working on accessibility.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges is that you want to make something general specific enough to be applicable for the mobile apps, but you don't want to limit it because technology develops very fast. So you don't want to limit it so that in the future it will have to change again. So it's a process, and I think it will remain a process. So with the small steps, we
Yeah, it
can.
sounds like it'll be a living document that we need to keep checking on as it evolves.
Yeah.
But very, very cool. So you're talking about we talked about WCAG. So there are some people that maybe haven't gotten into WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines before, or some people just who have seen it and wonder, why do we need these guidelines that are specific for mobile? How does accessibility on web, why is it really that different than accessibility on mobile? So, Tanya, would you like to help us out with that question?
Yes, sure. Well, the WCAG guideline was originally developed for the web, as Jan-Jaap mentioned. So while the intent of WCAG was always and remains good and aimed at the end users that needs to get more accessible web, the practical application and interpretation may be different for the mobile apps because mobile and web are different. So one of the main challenges, for example, for the mobile task force is around the definitions. Can we apply the same definitions that are now written for the web in the context of the mobile apps? And if we apply them, is it the same or do we need to alter it, that it's more applicable again to the mobile apps? And this is something what we see is coming back almost in every meeting because it's applicable to almost all success criteria. The gap between the mobile and web needs to be breached so that we get more common understanding. And at the same time, we see that there is still increasing pressure from the legislation, for example, that the apps need to become accessible. And then we need to understand, all different stakeholders need to understand, developers, testers, product owners, what is that, how to make the app accessible, and even further, different testing parties, because now there is a lot of room for interpretation. Different testing parties, for example, they have a different rules probably or different interpretations, so you cannot even always compare one audit with another. And the same with the developers, so they don't always know what to improve or how to improve. So this gap needs to be breached so that we so that the intent stays the same, but then we understand different parties and different stakeholders understand the implication for the mobile apps.
Awesome. Very, very good explanation. Yeah, there is this gap that you're talking about between the two. Um, Let me see. So, filling this gap, I was wondering if we could get a little bit more concrete and maybe talk about an example criterion that you guys have worked on. Some it could be any kind of example that you have. Maybe you could share your screen, JJ, and we could go check one out so we can see concretely what this guidance is looking like.
Yeah, so I just share my screen. So what I'm showing is the editor's draft. It's saying group draft note because we're in the process currently of publishing it, but this is actually the editor's draft of our guidance, which will be named Guidance on Applying WCAG 2.2 to Mobile Applications, and then short name is WCAG to Mobile. So this will be published pretty soon. By the time you will be seeing this, it should be published. So it will look like this document I'm showing right now. So we have a group of editors working on this, which are listed at the top. At the bottom, we also have a list of all the contributors in this document. So we have like 20, 30 people that have actively sort of contributed to this document.
Well,
And
that
an
is awesome.
example,
So these are all experts in mobile accessibility that are helping bring this
yes,
document together.
yeah, maybe let me just pull up quickly just to show this. Quite a long list of people, maybe it's even more than 20 or 30, that are either contributing as invited experts or where their organization is a member and they are contributing through their organization membership. So it's been a lot of people that have shared some thoughts, and it's nice to sort of, as Tanya mentioned, to really bridge the gap and reduce the amount of interpretation to have some clear guidance from our task force and hope that people will start using this. So I'm currently scrolling through this document, but I already pulled up one example. So the structure will be very familiar to people that are already used to WCAG or WCAG to ICT. So we have basically the same setup and the same styling because it's a formatting from WTC. So we have guidance for each success criterion. And what's the difference between WCAG and WCAG to ICT is that we have used something that we would call like an accordion or expand collapse component, where we have first the title of the success criterion, then we indicate the level. So this is still the same as in other guidance, but then we have this expand collapse for WCAG, which contains the guidance in WCAG 2.2. So it includes the information and some notes. And then we have expand collapse for WCAG to ICT. So they have already provided guidance. How do they feel it should be applied to non-web? So we have that also in there. So they have, for example, additional notes
So
about.
that's, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the category you were talking about that could also apply to a kiosk, not
Yes.
only a mobile application. Okay, so this
Yes.
is more broad
Yeah,
still.
it's broader, but still it's similar to to mobile apps if they are non-web. And then we have our guidance from the task force, which is trying to align as much as possible with WCAG to ICT, only sort of specifying maybe the differences that are maybe not applicable to mobile apps. Because for kiosks, for example, apps, if they always have a touchscreen, maybe your guidance is different than maybe kiosk or sort of banking terminals that might not have a touchscreen. So there are some distinctions there. But as Tanya mentioned, we should not assume, I mean, there can be smartphones and they don't necessarily have to run Android iOS that maybe not have a touchscreen. So we are still maybe broader than the 99% of users are using sort of mobile apps. But we have to make sure we also account for the 1% that's sort of deviating from there. For a concrete example, text spacing. So I've seen quite a few questions from this in various places about, how do I deal with text spacing in apps? And one of the confusing parts is that it reads content implemented using markup languages. But if you're making an app, at least a native app, you wouldn't be using markup languages, but would be using something like Swift or Kotlin or maybe Dart in Flutter or sort of TypeScript in React. I wouldn't necessarily call those markup languages. So we are substituting content implemented with markup languages with just content. And then there's additional guidance saying, if content supports the following textile properties, then they should support these bullet points listed below. And there's some confusion there, for example, that people expect on the web, it's possible to do a CSS override. So then content supports sort of textile properties. But in apps, or at least on Android and iOS, there's currently no support to set your preferred line height or preferred spacing or letter spacing or word spacing, at least not on every Android version, iOS version. Like there might be a specific vendor that has customized Android to do this. But if your Android version on your device does not support this, then we've added this note to clarify if you're not required to use these values. It's only that if this setting is available, then you need to support it. So that's just a clarification. And also on a note would say, if a mobile platform does not include a way for users to override textile properties, this success criterion is not applicable. It still leaves a little bit room for interpretation because we have currently not defined which mobile platforms do support it and which do not support it. And as you mentioned, it evolves quickly. So maybe Android 14 doesn't support it, but maybe 15 will. So we have to keep track somewhere, and that's maybe a good place in the understanding documents, because you don't want to update these sort of this WCAG to mobile guidance too quickly, but understanding documents, they can be updated more easily because you don't need the whole group to agree. You just need, it's just informative guidance that's additional. So it's a little bit easier to update those.
Okay, so that's good to know for the quicker changes that we should be looking at the understanding document that will come later on to have that really side by side.
Yeah, or potentially it could maybe still be in this document. We are still in sort of the drafting phase, and now that we are reaching the first public working draft, we are reaching out to the public. So anyone basically can provide comments and give feedback, what's missing, what's unclear, and based on that, we can sort of evolve our document. So perhaps it will be in this document, but we will, see that in a later stage.
That's actually a really great segue. I wanted to get into how people can actually contribute to this document that you're working on. You said it's open to the public and we can make comments somehow. How would we add some comments as a developer to this criterion?
Yes, so this one is an example that's sort of finished, or at least we feel for the draft it's finished, but some other criterions are still work in progress. So one example I would like to show is 3.1.1 language of page. So it still uses the same format. So we have the expand collapse, but it says placeholder because we haven't made our guidance. And then it has a note work in progress, which links to Github. So the mobile task force is using Github to keep track of discussions and sort of issues. So for each success criterion, we have an issue. So some issues are finished, those are closed, and other ones are still open. So it's really familiar, especially to developers, the way we are using Git. So the discussion includes our meeting minutes. So we meet every Wednesday currently, every week. So we have discussion there, but also we have sort of async discussions on GitHub outside of those meetings. So it includes the meeting notes. It includes some tags. So this is labeled as small variation, where the group decided it's likely to have a small deviation compared to WCAG. It can also be medium or large, just to give a little bit idea how much work is needed. It's not always right, because we've seen this felt like a small deviation, but we've discussed it quite a few times. So basically anyone can just leave a comment there. It's open, public. And one example I would like to give is that there's also other people also referencing these issues, because on GitHub, other people maybe have similar issues. So they reference also our issues, like this example. And also, we also relate our issue to specific issues from other companies. For example, Flutter, it's a known issue that the language of page cannot be set. So in HTML, it's really easy. You can use the lang attribute at the HTML tag at the top to set the whole language for your whole web page. But on Android, it's possible to, of course, localize your strings to show, for example, in Dutch, your app, and in English. But the screen reader is not using the right language. So if your system would be in English, but the app is available in Dutch, it will use the English speech synthesizer by default. So of course, users can sometimes switch between these speech engines, but not automatically. And that would fail, actually, WCAG, if it's not using the right speech engine automatically. So currently, it seems that on Android, we are investigating if it's possible. And it seems it's not possible, but on iOS, it is possible. Because on iOS, you have this accessibility language attribute that you can put at sort of the top level of your application. And those are, like I mentioned, maybe some things that we can add in a note or understanding or somewhere in the documentation that we know of certain gaps. And that can also help auditors to choose how to deal with it. And that's maybe Tanya can give some comment there, because then you have the discussion. Okay, we know it's a limitation of the framework or of the platform. Are we going to fill it or not? Because it's a limitation, but if you don't fill it, then maybe the framework will never fix it, because people won't complain, because they will still get their 100% score, for example. So
that sounds like an audit that you were talking about, Tanya, would get pretty complex when you're writing out the results of, okay, it passes on iOS, but not Flutter, not Android, or how do you handle that kind of audit result?
Yeah, this is a continuous discussion, because yes, indeed, there are certain constraints imposed by the platform or the framework that the developers are using. And then, basically in our audits, we say quite often, if it's not changed by the developers and a constraint is set by the platform, then we will not reject it, because there is very little that the developers can do to make this feature or to improve this constraint. But on the other side, also from the mobile task force, like we want that people, as many developers as possible, will push back to the developers of the platforms or to the framework, create issue and follow up on the issues, so that at the end, those who develop those platforms or frameworks, they will fix it. So then the developers will and can easily improve accessibility of the apps. And I think that we need to keep doing that, because there should be some leverage, or we need to create some leverage from a developer's perspective.
That's a really good question. You're talking about the developers giving pushback to the platforms, which I am all about. I think it's very valuable to send feedback like that. But as a task force, do you guys have any leverage to push back to a framework? Will they listen to you more than they will listen to a developer?
I don't think that it's a goal of the task force the goal of the task force is to make the guidance more applicable, let's say, more understandable in the context of the mobile apps. But the participants of the task force, they work, of course, also in the different organizations. So I think I think it's more personal initiative than the task of the mobile task force. Or maybe Jan-Jaap, you can.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult. Like ideally, you would like to work together with, for example, Google and Apple, and they are actually WWC members, but they are currently not, at least not actively sort of contributing in a mobile accessibility task force for various reasons. They also, of course, have their own guidelines with material design guidelines and Apple sort of the human interface guidelines, and those don't always align with WCAG, or maybe they have, sometimes they even have stricter requirements, and sometimes they have weaker requirements, or they are missing requirements. And yeah, ideally you would work together, but it's difficult because W2C is mostly for making web standards, and Apple and Google are just making their own Android, iOS operating system standards, and they are of course free to do so. But still, like Tanya mentioned, the developers that are building Android apps and iOS apps, if they cannot comply with legislation using Android or iOS, then they will probably push back, and then hopefully it will get solved. But I think where Mobile Task Force helps is if auditors will consistently flag issues or not, because now we have certain auditors that are really looking through the sort of their web glasses, and they're seeing, oh, this app doesn't set the language of the page, I'm just gonna fill it. Because on websites I can do this, so of course apps should also be able to do this, but maybe it's not possible. And in this case, I think it's actually a good idea, because it's better to fail too strictly than to be too mild in failing issues. But there can be examples where maybe it's just not technically possible, and then you have this discussion. Yeah, am I going to fail it, or am I gonna maybe not fail it for now because I know it's currently a limitation? Because an audit is always just one report from a moment in time for a specific app version, because sometimes we've seen it ourselves that we achieve status A, meaning you have like zero accessibility issues for the app, and then the next week they publish a new update and they break something, but our status A is still valid, at least in the Netherlands, for 3 years. That's another problem we are seeing, that it's really it's not, legislation is not always in line with how quickly software updates happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it sounds like you talked about legislation just there. Sounds like this set of guidelines is going to help us as developers and help us in our audits, whoever is auditing our application, but it may not necessarily help us legally. Like, will legal documents reference this set of guidelines like WCAG is referenced, do you think?
We would hope so, but it seems more likely that currently, for example, the EN 31509 standard, which is getting a lot of traction now because the European Accessibility Act is sort of around the corner, it's referencing WCAG to ICT. And I personally don't expect that they will, like, they have a chapter for software, which includes apps, but also kiosks, just like WCAG to ICT. It's a lot broader. So I don't expect legislators to really explicitly make a chapter just about mobile applications, but we are working together with WCAG to ICT. So if we have any findings in our task force that potentially can change the wording or change a note or update WCAG to ICT, then our task force can give this back to the WCAG to ICT task force. And if they make a modification and they are part of the legislation, then we will still impact the legislation. And actually the same applies to WCAG, because we can also find issues that relate directly to WCAG and also make suggestions there. So we have impact, but not directly through our guidance, but our guidance is, and our insights are impacting the other guidances that are already part of legislation.
Okay, so that's great to know, so that this does have ripple effects that go back into legislation.
Yes.
In addition to the guidelines. That is very cool. Well, I got completely off track from where I wanted to go. We were talking about contribution on GitHub here a few minutes ago. If someone wants to get more involved than just putting comments on GitHub, how can they do that with the task force?
Maybe I can answer it because I have a little bit more experience with this structure. So there is two ways. Like, one is invited expert. So anyone can just apply to WWC to become a member of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group. So you apply to the working group, not to the task force. That's a lot of confusion has been there. So you apply to become invited expert of the working group. And then if you're part of the working group, you can join any task force. So if you have specific experience with building accessible mobile apps or building accessible mobile web, because we are not only focusing on Android, iOS apps, but also on sort of focusing on mobile web and sort of web views inside native apps. So if you have any experience with any of those fields, then you can always try to apply as invited expert. And if you get accepted, you can just contribute, and there's no sort of cost involved. It's basically free to become invited expert. That's the first route people can take. The second route is if your organization is a W3C member, you can, as a member, join any working group. So if you are basically paying the membership fee, which depends on the size of your company, and of course, they're still vetting if your company is, can become a member. If you become a member, then you can just join the Accessibility Guidance Working Group and then also join the task force. So that's sort of two options.
Awesome. So you can join as an individual or as a company. So Abra is a company member, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, recently we have become one because in the past I was invited expert. I think Tanya was also invited expert for a couple of weeks, because then later we joined as a sort of full member, and now we are a full member. And I think maybe good to mention the difference that if you're invited expert in the guidance, it will say invited expert, and if you are a company member, it will actually list your company, so it can be incentive for people to have their company name listed there.
Yeah, it sounds like you'd get some good visibility as a company if you had people from your company contributing to show that your company really cares about accessibility.
Yeah.
So that sounds like something that if someone is very interested in joining, maybe talking to their company as a whole, seeing if they want to contribute.
Yes, so it can be a barrier for some, because invited experts, some people might not feel they are an expert, even though they might be an expert. So they might feel hesitant to apply, or they might be, maybe don't want to get rejected. So it can be barriers, and the same for membership. Can be expensive, especially because it's based on your whole company size. Even though if your accessibility department is maybe small, the fee is based on your whole company size. So it can be quite expensive for certain people that if their company is very large, they have to pay a really quite large membership fee, even though their accessibility efforts might be relatively small. So that's, in my opinion, one flaw there is. So it works really well for companies like Abra, where we are fully focused on accessibility. But if you're in a large organization and you just a couple people working on accessibility and you have to pay a really hefty membership fee, it's more difficult. Of course, they have more resources, so they should contribute more, but it's, in my opinion, slightly flawed. But otherwise, what you can do, like I mentioned, you can always contribute on Github. That's available for anyone. No need to be an expert, no need to be a member. You can just place your thoughts there, create issues, and just get involved in discussion, as long as you're sort of doing constructive contributions.
Yeah,
That's
and those
awesome.
questions we meet once per week, and then we have an agenda with a certain success criteria that we are now discussing. And if you post a comment or question or issue that you want to discuss, it's always being mentioned and discussed during the meeting. And then, so if you're interested in the outcome of the question, then it will be included into the meeting notes. So it's it's a nice way to get a response.
Yeah, that's another one of the questions I had. So to follow the progress of what you guys are working on, you said that you meet once a week and there's these meeting notes, so the public can read these meeting notes, right? So we can go in and check from last
Yes.
week what you guys talked about and kind of follow as you develop as you talk
Yes.
about different criterion.
Yeah, so the Mobile Accessibility Task Force has sort of its homepage on the w3.org website. So there is like a way to get to our meeting minutes. So they are published immediately and they're always public. Of course, they are minutes, so not everything that's being said is sort of captured there, but at least the most important parts are always captured, including sort of action points or tasks or any sort of polls or voting on sort of definitions or on guidance. So it's really all available, but it can be difficult for people to find their way through all these different pages and systems. So GitHub is really easy because you can just go to issues and click on a certain success criterion, and the meeting minutes are also included there. So basically one spot where you can find all details, and from there you can, of course, click to external links to get more details, but at least there's one page where you get all your info.
Awesome. So that at least gives us, I'll include that link in the description for this video, but that gives us a good place to start if you guys have a homepage and we can kind of work from there. I've got one last question for you guys, and this one is kind of looking out to the future here. This is such a great project, such a great task force helping the mobile accessibility community. What kind of impact do you see this task force having on this field in the next few years?
Yeah, I think creating a more accessible guideline that is applicable to in the context of the mobile apps, so that it becomes easier to understand, to interpret, and to implement or to improve accessibility. So that the goal is so that everyone who is involved, and of course especially developers, that it's easily accessible, understandable, and easy to implement. That's the goal, to my opinion.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I just really hope it becomes the go-to document that if an app developer is building something that needs to be accessible, that they can just use the Mobile Accessibility Task Force guidance as a reference, and hopefully they understand the wording we have used, so be a little bit more specific to the mobile space. And like one personal goal for me would also be hopefully to have effect on legislation. So either through the ripple effect you mentioned, through WCAG and WCAG to ICT, but of course, would be nice if maybe legislation decide, okay, maybe mobile apps are becoming such an important part of people, their lives. Perhaps we need a different chapter specifically for mobile apps. I'm not sure if that will happen, but that would of course be really nice if they add such a chapter, and if they add such a chapter, if they would then use the mobile accessibility task force guidance there. But either way, through the ripple effect or through interpretation, it will already hopefully have a big impact on making more apps accessible.
Well, this is so cool. Thank you guys. I'll include links to so that everyone can follow your progress on this task force as we go on. But if anyone listening wants to follow you two specifically, do you have a platform of choice that you use on social media that I can include as well?
I think LinkedIn.
LinkedIn?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn, I think we're both quite active. And another place is nice is, of course, the App Foundation with the Slack. So we have a Slack workspace there. So we also have an account there. So you can also just DM us there, or use one of the channels there. Yeah, so I think those are two ways to easily get in touch.
Okay, great. I'll include those links so people can join and reach out and connect with you guys on LinkedIn for sure, because I know you share some good content. I see that going by on my feed as well. But with all that, we've covered a lot of ground, so I think we can wrap it up here today. I want to thank you again for your time. Thank you for everything that you two are doing for the space of mobile accessibility. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this task force evolves over the next few months and years. And best of luck, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Robin, for having us. And yeah, let's make more apps accessible.
Ooh, it's a good message to end on. Okay, I'll stop the recording here.